On a rainy Tuesday morning in Washington, D.C., an American morning show aired a segment that would ignite a storm all the way across the Pacific. It was supposed to be just another lighthearted discussion, the kind of filler content networks use when nothing important is happening. But that day, one careless comment, one sentence, would ripple through millions of Filipinos around the world. The anchor, a veteran reporter named Charles Whitman, laughed as he shared a supposedly humorous story about his trip to Asia. He leaned back in his chair, looked into the camera, and said, "Filipinos speak English, but not very well." The studio audience chuckled. But across the globe, in homes from Manila to Cebu, from California to Dubai, Filipinos watching the clip online felt a sting. Not from the words themselves, but from the arrogance behind them. Yet no one could have predicted what would happen next. Because on that same show, sitting quietly off camera, was a guest whose life story would overturn every stereotype and reveal a truth the world had forgotten. A truth about the Filipino spirit, the Filipino mind, and the Filipino voice. This is that story. Before we continue, kindly write in the comment section where you are watching from. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more Philippine story like this. Charles Whitman had worked in broadcasting for more than 30 years. Sharp suits, perfect hair, polished delivery. He was the kind of journalist older Americans trusted. So when he chuckled and said, "Filipinos use English, but, well, it's not exactly good English," the audience accepted it as fact. Maybe he meant no harm. Maybe he was simply repeating an old misconception. But misconceptions can wound. For Filipinos in the United States, nurses, caregivers, veterans, engineers, teachers, the comment reopened memories of mockery and misunderstanding. For Filipinos in the Philippines, it echoed a long history of being judged through Western eyes. The clip spread quickly online. Some were angry. Some were hurt. Some were simply tired. But what none of them knew was that fate had already prepared the perfect person to respond. Someone who had lived through poverty, migration, humiliation, and triumph. A man who understood both the English language and the Filipino heart better than anyone else on that set. His name was Dr. Lorenzo Enzo Ramos. Dr. Enzo Ramos wasn't a celebrity. He wasn't a politician, nor a best-selling author. He was invited to the show to talk about a new study on multilingual education. A small, forgettable segment, until everything changed. He sat quietly during the show's opening banter. Polite, observant. In his early 60s, Enzo had silver hair, gentle eyes, and the dignified presence of a scholar who'd lived through much and learned even more. He had been born in a tiny barangay in Leyte, a fishing village, a place where children grew up barefoot, playing under coconut trees, and where English was never heard outside of school. His parents were humble, a father who repaired fishing nets, a mother who washed clothes by the river. They never imagined their son would one day stand in front of the world. As a child, Enzo's English was rough, halting, uncertain. He struggled with pronunciation. He stumbled through grammar. And he remembered, like a knife, every time someone laughed at his accent. But he also remembered something else. A teacher named Mrs. Villoria. An old woman with thick glasses, a stern voice, and a soft heart. She taught English with passion, even though she herself had never left the Philippines. To her, English was not just a subject. It was a key. A key that could open doors her students couldn't yet see. She told little Enzo, "Your accent does not define your intelligence. Your grammar does not define your worth. Language is a bridge, not a measure of superiority." He carried those words for decades. So when Charles Whitman mocked Filipino English that day, Enzo felt the weight of every Filipino child who had ever been belittled. Every OFW who had ever been mocked for the way they spoke. Every nurse, teacher, or worker told their English wasn't good enough. He didn't know he would speak that morning. But destiny had other plans. When the live broadcast reached the point where Enzo was introduced, the show's mood had already shifted. Charles was relaxed, unaware of the storm brewing online. Joining us now, he announced, is Dr. Lorenzo Ramos, a linguistics expert here to talk about multilingual education. Doctor, welcome. Enzo smiled politely. Thank you for having me. Charles continued, Doctor, before we begin, you're Filipino, correct? Yes, Enzo replied gently. So, Charles chuckled, what do you think about what I said earlier? You folks speak English, but, well, you know. The co-hosts laughed nervously. The studio fell into a quiet, uneasy stillness. Enzo could have dodged the question. He could have smiled and kept the peace. But the years in his heart were too heavy. And so he spoke, calmly, powerfully, and with unshakable dignity. Mr. Whitman, Enzo said softly, may I tell you a story? Charles, caught off guard, nodded. Of course. Enzo continued. When I was a child, I lived in a small village where English was not spoken at home. My parents barely finished elementary school. But they worked with everything they had to send me to a public school. The studio leaned forward. My English was far from perfect. I learned it from teachers who themselves were learning as they taught. But despite our limited resources, we tried. He paused. And try is something Filipinos do very well. Charles swallowed but said nothing. We learn English not because we want to impress anyone, Enzo continued. And not because we want to sound American. We learn it because it lets us speak to the world. A murmur went through the room. Enzo raised his eyes slightly. Filipinos learned English under difficult circumstances. During colonization, after war, after poverty, after natural disasters. We rebuilt. And rebuilding meant learning the language of opportunity. He went on. With English, Filipino nurses save lives in hospitals across the globe. Filipino teachers educate children in America, Canada, and the Middle East. Filipino seafarers navigate the oceans and keep international trade alive. Filipino caregivers comfort the elderly in nations far from their own families. And every day, Enzo added, millions of Filipinos communicate with the world in English, regardless of accent, regardless of grammar, regardless of ridicule. The studio fell silent. Then Enzo leaned slightly toward Charles and asked, Mr. Whitman, when you said our English is terrible, did you judge us by our grammar? Or by our humanity? The beat. 2 beats. 3. Charles opened his mouth but said nothing. Enzo continued. Because Filipinos speak English to survive. To work. To uplift our families. Not to be perfect, but to be understood. And there is nothing terrible about that. Another co-host finally broke the silence. Doctor, your English now is flawless. How did you? Enzo smiled. I earned a scholarship, he said softly. I studied linguistics and later became a professor. I eventually taught English in the United States. The hosts gasped. But Enzo wasn't finished. Do you know who inspired me to become a teacher? He asked. An old Filipino woman with broken English. My teacher. Mrs. Villoria. He looked into the camera. She taught me that a language is not a test of intelligence. A language is a tool. And Filipinos have used that tool to raise families, build dreams, and conquer the world with kindness. Charles lowered his head slightly. Doctor, I didn't mean to offend anyone, he said quietly. Enzo nodded. Of course. But sometimes, Mr. Whitman, the easiest comments hurt the deepest. Then he smiled warmly, not with anger, but with compassion. But this is not about blame. It is about recognition. He turned to the audience. The world must understand that Filipino English is not terrible. It is unique. It is beautiful. It carries history, resilience, sacrifice, and love. And most importantly, it carries the voices of millions of people who just want to be heard. The clip of Enzo's statement went viral within hours. Filipinos worldwide shared it with pride. And nurses in New York cried watching it. OFWs in Hong Kong replayed the video again and again. Elderly Filipinos in California said, "Finally, someone spoke for us." Teachers in the Philippines used it as inspiration for students. Even linguists and scholars praised his explanation of accent versus ability, language versus worth, communication versus perfection. Within 24 hours, the network issued an apology. Charles Whitman himself visited the Philippines months later, not for tourism, but to understand the people he had once underestimated. And who did he visit first? Mrs. Viloria, the woman whose broken English built a giant. Dr. Enzo Ramos returned to Leyte a year later. He walked the familiar dirt road of his childhood. The coconut trees swayed like they did in his youth. He found his old school, weathered, yet still alive. And outside, sitting on a wooden bench, was a very old woman with gray hair and gentle eyes. "Enzo," she murmured. "Ma'am," he whispered. She smiled through tears. "You speak English very well now." He knelt in front of her. "Because of you," he said. "Always because of you." She held his hands. "No, hijo, because of who you chose to become." This story is fictional, but the truth behind it is not. Filipinos around the world speak English. With courage, with effort, with sacrifice. Their English carries the weight of migration, the hopes of families, and the dreams of generations. And whether accented or fluent, whether perfect or imperfect, every word is a testament to resilience. So the next time someone asks, "Why do Filipinos speak English?" the answer is simple. Because they had to. Because they chose to. Because they worked for it. Because it opened doors. Because it helped them survive. Because it helped them soar. Because language does not belong to one nation. It belongs to everyone willing to learn it. And Filipinos, with their strength, their humility, their kindness, have mastered more than just English. They have mastered the art of being heard.